We're educating a generation to become anxious, to become depressed, to become ADHD. We have become probably the biggest cause of the spread of ill mental health, mental distress, and the consequences of that.
Would you agree that there are things like this, there are disorders, like ADHD is a disorder?
No, it doesn't.
Sami Timimi is a psychiatrist, author, and expert in child and adolescent psychiatry. He challenges mainstream views on ADHD and autism, breaks myths, and explains why a holistic, personalized approach to mental health is crucial.
I'm very curious to hear what you meant by there is no such thing as a dysregulated emotion.
What the hell is that? Emotions are just emotions.
The rise of anxiety, especially amongst the younger lot. What do you think is going on here?
I mean, you wouldn't get out of bed if you didn't get some anxiety. That's part of having challenges.
What reasons are they describing that's contributing to their anxiety?
A lot of the time.
But I have to say that I just have so much respect for all the work that you do and all that you stand for, because I myself am a huge advocate of holistic well-being and just seeing things in totality as opposed to this very reductionist approach that seems to now dominate the health space. And yeah, I just love how you approach things with such compassion and real care, which is really missing in the world. But for those who are not familiar with your work and with who you are, what would you say is your message to the world?
My main work at the moment is to do with trying to help people look beyond the messages that we're getting about what mental health is and what mental health isn't, because I think we have been pathologizing ordinary and or understandable reactions that human beings have to their circumstances. And instead of looking at those circumstances, not just from a personal point of view, but from a societal point of view, I think there is a very understandable set of responses that people are going through and that reflect what's happening in our economy, in our politics, in our society more broadly. And turning these into mental disorders, for me, it's become emblematic of what I call the mental health industrial complex, which is shifting attention away from these social causes and social sources of suffering and turning them into individual causes and individual labels, and essentially trapping people, whether with good intentions or not, trapping people in an idea that there's something wrong in them. And I think that's just destructive for our mental health. It's probably the biggest cause of our mental distress and mental ill health that we have at the moment is the tendency towards medicalizing, pathologizing,
Labeling,
pointing to the idea that there's something wrong in you.
Gosh, we've dug straight in the core of this topic because it's such a relevant point that you make. And indeed, your work is extremely revelational in so many ways, because the normal, conventional way of mental health is actually quite destructive, because we are obsessed with, I think it's almost cool to label people because it sounds like in vogue. Well, I have ADHD, I have, anxiety, which people are dropping like it's so casual. And of course, we'll dive in this further, but I suppose this is what inspired your book, which is your 8th book, I believe, Searching for Normal.
It depends on how you count it, because I've also edited quite a few books as well.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the
8th
premise
one.
of Searching for Normal?
Well, Searching for Normal is really an extension of the things that I have been doing and researching. I'm a clinician as well. I work as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I've got many years of experience behind me. The idea for it really came from a series of discussions that I had. For example, I was talking to my youngest daughter. My children are all adults.
How old is your youngest daughter?
Well, she is now 27. So this was a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
and we'd had COVID and we'd had all of those. And she was just talking about that general sense of insecurity and a feeling that things don't work anymore, difficulty finding good jobs. People who were in work, like her friends and people she knew, all of them seemed to be dissatisfied. In this country, in the UK, a lot of young people could look forward to, at some point, maybe owning their own home. That all looked beyond, housing rents were so high. Owning a house seemed like even for kind of a middle class, children of middle class parents, even for them, it seems to be out of the league. So that's just general. And then she was telling me that friends of hers, while they were at university, after they're coming out of university, they were ending up with therapists or being referred to psychiatrists or psychologists, and they were getting labeled. And then my oldest daughter, and I've got 3 grandchildren through her.
Wow. Lucky
Talking
you.
about yeah, I know, they're wonderful. Talking about, parents at schools, teachers, even at the nursery, and how this idea that children have, if they're playing up in any way, if they get upset or if they get aggressive, people start to ask questions about what mental health problem they have. Maybe an autism, that one just seems to be running amok. But all these kids who are suspected of having an autistic disorder. And then in my clinic, so things went kind of quiet over when it was lockdowns. But every time we came out of a lockdown, we had this surge of referrers. And even before we went into the whole COVID fiasco, there was in the news regularly this idea that we're experiencing mental health epidemics and that services weren't able to keep up with the number of referrals. So this was before all of this big social event happened in people's lives that, spread the idea that, having social contact became dangerous. But the real struggle was when kids had to go back to school and had to go back to these types of environments, having been out of them. And the referrals shot up for things like self-harm, anxiety, and neurodiversity took on a whole bigger place in the way we think about. So the manager of the overall service that I work in now, a child and adolescent mental health service, says 80% of the people who attend our services have a neurodiversity or are neurodivergent. In other words, they have things like autism or ADHD or any of the other myriad of
They're diagnosing
things.
themselves.
Well, they're being diagnosed, and the ones that are not diagnosed, the clinicians in our service will say, the reason you're not responding to what we think you should respond to is probably because you've got autism or you've got ADHD. Or so this.
Very careless.
And then we have a whole lot of people, very understandably, parents, teachers, and young people themselves, coming to the conclusion that they must have a mental disorder. And the really sad thing for me is when I see people going down that route, because I now understand that what we call psychiatric diagnoses are not diagnoses, not in the medical sense, because they don't refer to any particular cause. They're just a description of things, of experiences or behaviors. So when we call them symptoms, we've turned a set of experiences or set of behaviors into something very different.
Sure.
We've put a framework around them, a way of understanding them. And what seems to happen now that I understand that they're not diagnoses, but they function socially as commodities, as something with a market value, something that can be bought and sold, but something that offers the consumer an idea that if you take on this commodity, it's going to make your life better in some sort of
Yeah.
way. It's going to solve or ameliorate or do something for that sense of dissatisfaction that you may be experiencing. But like most commodities, because they're only skin deep, and because they satisfy a desire that's there in that place at that time, that sense that you found what you're looking for doesn't last. So what I see happening is once you've inducted people into this sort of consumption, whether it's with a particular diagnosis or products that go along with that diagnosis, like particular therapies, or the worst thing is psychiatric medication.
Yeah, we'll talk about
After a
that.
while, it does not work. It doesn't seem to be delivering. But now that you've been inducted into that way of thinking, you start to think, well, maybe that's because I had another condition that needs diagnosing. So what
Very
you start to see in people, and this is very sad for me, seeing young people going down this route, is you might start with a diagnosis of autism. Bit later, you'll go on to maybe a diagnosis of ADHD. A bit later, it might be depression. Then they might start thinking of something else, like a personality disorder or bipolar or any of the other ones that might be around. So you're in danger of collecting labels unless you can push back.
Okay, so first things first, what you're saying are very valid points and so refreshing, because from what I understand is the key difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist is that psychiatrists actually can prescribe medication, right? Is that the key
Yes.
difference, you would say? So I love your view that...
The key difference is that as psychiatrists, we're doctors. We're originally trained as doctors. So it's
Hence
not
the
just about...
medication.
in other words, theoretically, we could deliver all the different potential interventions, including medication, but we should also have an understanding of the physical health consequences. So, the psychological consequences of having a physical health condition, but also the physical health consequences of having a psychological condition. So, for example, people or older people who decide for whatever reason, but they're not going to eat because they're wanting to lose weight or because they're anxious about types of food, or they've got on hunger strike, which I've seen as well, as a protest, or they've got body image problem, whatever it is. Of course, these have physical health consequences that you also have to be able to learn how to manage. So it's more than just the fact that we can prescribe medication.
And I am particularly interested in the rise of anxiety, especially amongst the younger lot. What do you think is going on here? They come to your clinic to talk about this, I'm sure. What are the crux of this? The core issue that lies at why there's so many young people dealing with anxiety.
What do you think? I'd be interested to
I think
hear your reflections.
Okay, so here are two things. There's a lot of awareness these days, and there's this urge to fix your state of being and fix your moods, and hence the labeling as well. Or we are over catastrophizing stuff that's also meant to be a part of the human experience, because that's what feels right to do. That's my view, but I'd love to hear from you. And of course, the social media and comparison and insecurity as well. But there are labels now that you guys in your generation never heard of growing up. So I'm just wondering why the sudden change.
I think you're spot on. I think that's pretty much the process that I think is happening. And it's the reason why I am now dead set against anti-stigma and mental health awareness campaigns.
Oh my God.
Not because I don't think it's a good thing for us to be able to talk about these things. I think we should be talking about, how we feel and how we're... But because of the framework we put around this idea of mental health awareness, what it's doing is it's getting people to start examining themselves and assuming that some of their intense emotional reactions and understandable or ordinary things that happen, particularly when you're growing up is challenging. You know? I mean, you
Yeah.
wouldn't get out of bed if you didn't get some anxiety. There'd be a reason. You
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
have
you know,
some anxiety. That's part of, and having challenges and changes that are going on. I think the role of adults around you is not to stop you from having that. That's a terrible thing to do because you undermine people's development of their own natural resilience. So instead, if you start people thinking that this could be a sign that you're developing a disorder, you start to interpret your emotional reactions in a certain way that will actually strengthen them. It will actually make them turn from something that's meaningful or something that's ordinary or something that you learn to live with into meaningless torture. And especially when we start adding the idea that, like with physical health conditions, early diagnosis and early intervention is often very important for future recovery. Now that we've added that into mental health, it's not surprising that parents, teachers, and people themselves start to think, oh, I need to get this diagnosed and I need to get treatment and I need to get treatment. And it's not something that they can find a way to live through or manage in themselves. There was a wonderful paper by a child psychiatrist colleague and friend of mine, an Australian child psychiatrist called John Nuruddini. He wrote it a few years ago, and the title of the paper says it all, I think. The title of his paper was Let the Children Cry. And he said, our role as parents is not to stop our children falling, but it's to
right.
be there and to help them through so that they can learn how to pick themselves up and carry on.
Very
and actually
powerful.
try and intervene and stop these things from happening, you are going to undermine your chances of growing up and being able to tolerate and learn how to live with the inevitability of powerful emotions. How can we experience joy if we've never experienced suffering?
True.
Is that possible, Eden? How can we know the difference? And of course, in the consumer orientated society that we have, where these things are now, if you like, I see them as brands, and where we have the social media, where social media comes into this is not it is not the cause of these epidemics, but it does turbocharge these ideas. So these ideas can spread around quickly, and of course, young people's minds are still very impressionable. And it's kind of not surprising that more and more people get identified with, because when people are describing things like anxiety or ADHD, they're describing fairly ordinary experiences. So how do you know if your worries or stresses are just understandable, ordinary, part of growing up, part of the difficult things that have happened in your life? How would you know the difference between that and
That's my
some
question.
disorder? Well, you don't. You can't.
But how would you tell if something's a normal distress experience versus a disorder? Like, would you agree that there are things like this that are disorders, like ADHD is a disorder? I mean, it
No.
exists to have ADHD or
No,
depression.
it doesn't. It doesn't exist as anything with the word disorder after it, you should be suspicious. You don't have an asthma disorder. You don't have a diabetes disorder.
Okay,
So the
condition?
disorder,
Are there
the
conditions
word,
or no? Not even.
the word has been put in there to create the impression that there is a way of differentiating between something that is considered healthy and something that is considered not. But what I did, you see, I think we work in my profession and the allied professions in mental health, we work not at the level of people's emotions and not at the level of people's behaviors. We work at the level of what I call meta-emotions. And it's about what framework of interpretation are you going to put on your experiences, because that has a huge impact on how you understand what's happening. So we are not in the business of discovering the causes or the reasons for your behavior or your experience. Sometimes we can. There might be a physical health condition that we can find out about that has gone missing, which is again another reason why it's useful to have doctors who are also part of this. We, do some proper doctor. And sometimes there are things in the person's background, so that their strongest association, if you like, in the research between the likelihood of experiencing a variety of different types of distress, from compulsions to psychosis to high levels of anxiety, panic attacks, whatever, is adverse experiences. So adverse experiences of all types just increase your likelihood, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. It is just means that, you are more likely to experience some of these things. The rest of it, the genes are empty. Nobody can find any neurological differences. So that you can't go to your psychiatrist or psychologist and ask them if they could take a blood test or a brain scan.
Of course, no, of course.
To test positive for ADHD or autism, because nobody can find anything specific in that biological realm.
But would you agree that there is indeed a rise in very low focus levels, and that's just because of the construct we're in with social media and our devices and always being distracted? Is that just it, or it actually has affected the way we function internally as well? Our brain's always on a go.
Well, in terms of how it's affected our brains, who knows? I don't know of any evidence that shows that it's actually affected our brains in a particular way. Johann Hari wrote a very good book called Stolen Focus. You might have come across it.
That's how I discovered you, from this beautiful book.
I see. Yes. Okay. Yeah. And what he points to, which I think is a reasonable hypothesis that he's putting forward, is that we have created cultural pastimes which reinforce a short attention span.
Correct.
If that could be affecting us, at the biological level, because our brains are, one of the function of the brains is not just to coordinate all the different bodily functions, but also to navigate the organism through its environment. There's no need for those parts of the brain if there isn't an environment to navigate. So, of course, the brain is going to be influenced by the feedback loops that it gets from the environment. And the way I see it is, I think social media is
responsible.
Is if you like, reinforcing or turbocharging those ideas and those tendencies, but it isn't the ultimate cause of it.
That's the word, turbocharging it. That's exactly the word.
Yeah.
So are the majority of your clients, are they like older people? Are they Gen Zs, younger people? What bracket do they fall under?
As a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I work with people up until the age of 18. So, I'm witnessing what's happening, if you like, to the younger generation, but also what's happening to parents. Because, parents are coming under so much pressure these days because there's so much around that it's also parents who get very concerned that their child has this or that disorder.
Yes.
And there are so many anxieties about parenting because there are so many different ways in which they are being monitored.
Am I doing
And
this right? Am I doing that right? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So it just, as it's become really hard just to be an ordinary kid, struggling with the ordinary and understandable, and even though the title of my latest book is Searching for Normal, I don't think normal is a great construct because it's, again, very hard to grasp. So I prefer the words ordinary and or understandable. Most of parenting is muddling through. But if you love your kids, you'll find a way through.
Yeah.
But there is, how you allowed to parent these days seems to have got narrower and narrower. So parents are full of guilt. And it seems to have encouraged a kind of hands-off parenting where you're waiting for the professional to tell you rather than, your grandmother or passed down wisdom or relatives who are around. Plus, parents are more isolated these days. They're not embedded in extended families or community settings. So they're physically isolated and also psychologically they feel they have a lot of pressures and a lot of advertising about how things are going to go wrong for your children. So they're very wary. So children end up being hyper monitored at school, at home. So there's all this
backfires
anxiety.
anyway, I'm sure. Hyper monitoring, helicopter parenting, that doesn't have good effects in the long run.
Yeah. So we've got kids who where it's hard just for a kid just to be ordinary without a worry that there's something going on, something wrong with them, something that means a professional that you can't sort out as a parent. But it's also tough on parents.
Sure. But as far as the younger lot goes, what reasons are they describing that's contributing to their anxiety when they come to you?
A lot of the time they're talking in terms of a sense that there's something wrong in them. There has been a lot of research in the last 5 to 10 years of various school-based intervention programs, but with the aim of preventing the onset of anxiety and depression in particular. And there's been programs that use mindfulness, programs that use cognitive behavioral therapy, programs that use a variety of different approaches. There's a kind of a whole school educational approach that and the research that's coming out from that consistently is either it makes no difference to the likelihood of people ending up with what are considered symptoms of anxiety or depression. This is mainly based on questionnaires because that's what we call symptoms. That's how we get our idea of what symptoms are. It's people filling in questions rather than anything more concrete than that. Or it either makes no difference to the likelihood, or actually those who've been through these prevention programs are more likely to end up with experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety. So it seems that we seed the idea where actually by talking about these things in terms of this is the signs and symptoms of this disorder and this is how you might work with them, the bit about how you might work with them and how you might help yourself goes away. And the bit that stays in a lot of young people's mind is, so if they become anxious, and there's all sorts of things that might make young people anxious. So I've seen people who are, so for example, we always get a spike in referrals close to exam times, particularly from
Yes.
who are doing their main exams. So that's one source. We often get referrals after young people have been in a relationship and there's been a breakup. So you might get self-harm and suicidal feelings and anxiety. We've had a big spike in the number of young people who are refusing to go to school, saying they're too anxious to go to school. Sadly, once they dug their heels in, and everybody's accepted the idea they're not going back, it's almost impossible to get them back these days. It didn't used to be the case, because we've so embedded the idea now that there's something wrong in them.
So,
Everybody sort of backs off and can't do anything. We're educating a generation to become anxious, to become depressed, to become ADHD. We have become probably the biggest cause of this spread of mental health, mental distress, and the consequences of that.
by planting the seed, by planting the idea and overexposing them to this all the
So
time.
I wrote a recent paper with Professor Bastra, who's a psychologist I know from the Netherlands. And it was about something that is now a recognized phenomena in most Western societies, and it's particularly prevalent in the English-speaking countries, which tend to be the countries with the most well-developed mental health services. And it's something that we've labeled the treatment prevention paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Those countries that have developed the most, where a bigger and bigger section of population is accessing treatment, and where there are anti-stigma and prevention programs, seem also to be the countries with the highest prevalence of mental disorders and people accessing. So the increasing access of treatment has not done anything to reduce the prevalence of mental disorders. It seems to have done, or at least it's associated with, the opposite.
Jesus.
And one of the things that we argued in this paper was the focus on an individual approach, the focus on diagnosis and treatment, whether it's psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy, is reinforcing this idea and effectively educating a population to think in terms of distress and discomfort as an individual thing that requires treatment. I mean, we're basically arguing that prevention would be better by focusing on
Individual.
the social determinants of mental health, which are mainly the ones that flow out from inequality.
So basically, we've all made this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yep.
That's feeding
what
the
it seems
cycle
like.
over and over.
Yep. And that's because mental distress is a pan-human experience, but how you interpret the meaning of that and the significance of that in itself either helps in terms of getting through or learning from or dealing with, or reinforces that mental distress shouldn't be there. And if you keep that message up, that you need treatment for this mental distress, it's in you, you're the person who needs treatment, and this is the way to deal with it, then what you are setting people up is for a long-term struggle with a part of themselves that they now interpret as something that shouldn't be there, or something that's dangerous, or something that needs to be kept under control.
Right.
And something that erupts from time to time, so that, you get a diagnosis, you get some medication, you keep it quiet for a bit, but it's always there in the background. So you're creating a recipe for a potentially long-term struggle with a part of yourself that you've now identified as broken, disorder, dysfunctional, pathological.
Right, because what I understand you say so far, Rob, like we have actually denormalized pain and suffering, which is a very normal part of the human experience. And would you say then that our avoidance of discomfort has contributed to this crisis, essentially?
It's kind of the exploitation of discomfort. None of us can avoid discomfort. And sadly, of course, some people are going to have more uncomfortable, more suffering than others. And we see that around the world. And I guess in my latest book, I'm also tying it to what I see as happening in the political field, where what I think is going on in the political field is that we are in a phase where the Western Empire is in crisis.
Yes.
It's in an economic crisis, but it's also in a crisis of legitimacy. People don't trust the politics anymore. People don't believe that that the politicians, our mainstream politicians, know how to get us out of these endless crises. Nothing very right. And so there is a general gloom and general despondency. And what's happened to left-wing politics in the West was that it was taken over by identity politics. So class and inequality lost its centrality in left-wing politics a while back. And identity politics is something else that is now merged into what I call the mental health industrial complex, because it's all about this idea that there's something about me. It's this hyper-individualism, this consumerism, and it becomes a fight for minority rights, or this person's rights, or this group's rights, or more visibility. So both identity and mental health disorders become like a commodity vacuum cleaner that's taking this distress and turning it into something individual. So it makes money. So it becomes another way to make money off that distress, dissatisfaction. And it keeps the power system, the inequalities in place, because it keeps the focus on what to do about these different groups, whether it's identity groups, how to include them better in our culture, or people would now classed as having these mental health disorders. And it's part of this kind of winner-loser system that capitalism encourages. And it's a way of appearing to be compassionate towards those people who essentially got classified as part of a loser class.
No, it's all propaganda, basically, and pursuing greed at the cost of people's lives.
Yep. And it obviously it serves to distract politically. Governments look like they're being compassionate if they put more money into mental health, and this is a big problem, and we need to support people.
My God, where does this end?
All the while, what they're doing, whether their intentions are good or not, is they are reinforcing the idea that all of these epidemics of mental health disorders and diagnoses and long waiting lists are to do with individuals who've got something wrong with them and a health service that needs to keep expanding to help them at the individual level. And the only political bit that comes into that, or the main political bit that comes into that, is protest about there not being enough money and not being enough funding. But the structural causes of that social sense of nihilism, of things being broken, of that insecurity can be put to one side.
Wow. So you started working in the clinic in your early 1990s, from what I heard,
Yes.
from what I
Yeah.
read. And at that time, you prescribed maybe one person medication. So
It
when
was
did
really,
this whole...
yeah. I mean, when I consider myself a traditional child psychiatrist. My first job
Meaning?
in child psychiatry was in
Yeah.
1990. I qualified as a doctor in 1988, where I did my usual bits of doctorate. My first job in child psychiatry was 1992. And in that department was in central London.
Yeah.
We were based in a pediatric hospital. So we had the top 2 floors in this pediatric hospital. We had a couple of beds, so there were we could admit people. And during the time I was there were a couple of people who were admitted from time to time, often with a psychosis, and they would be the
Seizures, you
ones.
said.
Sorry,
Seizures as well? Okay, only psychosis, which
yeah,
is quite a severe condition, right?
There would be, they would get medication. But medication wouldn't be seen as the treatment.
Yeah,
It would
or
be
a
seen
norm.
as part
Yeah.
of, we would also, the main way of thinking in that department was systemical. So
Yeah.
we didn't used to categorize anybody by a diagnosis. They'd have what was called a presenting problem. So it could be an overdose, behavior problems was very common, eating issues, self-harm. So it was just a very broad problem-based. And we talk about the identified patient. The identified patient would be the person who was referred, but we didn't think of it in terms of this young person is the problem and we have to fix this young person. It wouldn't be thought of in that individual way. It didn't. So there were 2 things that I really learned that drew me to child psychiatry in that department, renting that department. First was the concept of development.
Sure.
And very broadly, that means change. Over time, kids will change. Their interests will change, their body will change, the way they think will change. So one thing you can predict is they will change. The one thing you can't predict is how they will change.
True.
That's the things you have to discuss. But this idea that you've got to fix things at this moment in time, and this is what's going on in them, just wasn't there. The idea was, to help them. And the second thing was context, which is particularly when you're talking about children and young people, a lot of the decisions in their life are not going to be made by them. In fact, most of the big decisions, where they live, what school they go to, what they have to do, most of those are taken by adults in various caring relationships around them. So how could you really involve a treatment process without, important members of your family? So we always met with families. We always thought of children in the concepts of families. We thought about them in their schools, in their histories, and we had an optimistic idea about change. Now, I think that's true in all stages of life. I'm coming to a stage of life where I'm going to be thinking about retiring. Big changes are going to happen. Things don't stand still. There's another problem with labeling. You kind of fix people into a certain
So from your time that you started, this whole business of branding and labeling only began much later, thanks to Big Pharma, right?
Well, Big Pharma was part of it. And ADHD was probably the beginning of it in the UK.
Yeah, I did the research,
So it
Sir
had
George
taken
something.
off.
He's the one who flagged it first. Sir George Still,
Well, there were a number of people who, interestingly enough, people like Keith Connors and I've forgotten the name of another very prominent child psychiatrist who was involved in developing the
Charles
concept.
Bradley?
No,
He was
that's
the
no.
first to give
You're going
medication.
a lot further back. No, in terms of the
Yeah.
modern concept of ADHD,
All right. All right.
I keep confusing his name with Eisenstein, but
Okay.
but anyway, he wrote some of the original papers with Leo Kanner. He first came up with the concept of autism. But both of them, in their final years before they passed, said that they regretted bringing this to the world.
Wow.
That this was they now think this was a disaster for child psychiatry to bring this to the world. So yeah, in the 1990s, things started shifting, and British doctors started looking towards the American model. And as we got to the end of the 1990s and child depression, which again, when I was training, there's no such thing as child depression. We didn't think of that was thought of as a condition that might affect adults, but that children were not psychologically developed enough for us to think of it in these terms. We thought of it as, if you wanted to make a diagnosis, it would be something like an emotional disorder. You wouldn't call it depression. You wouldn't call it anxiety. We didn't used to call it. But of course, Prozac had come on the market in America and was soon to become a big hit. And so it was in the late 1990s that they first did some studies with children, with young people, and found that not only did it not work, but it actually increased the likelihood of suicidal impulses. So it was worse than not working. However, that shouldn't get in the way of a good commodity, of something that could sell well. And basically the story started to spread that childhood depression was a condition that affected children, and because we were missing it and thinking that children don't get depressed, there are these, hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of children being left to suffer without a voice. So books and articles started to be written about, childhood depression being an important diagnosis that was missed. And in its coattails came prescribing. And even though there's been a lot of controversy about prescribing child antidepressants to children, following the research that showed that it increases the likelihood of suicidal impulses, suicidal attempts, compared to a placebo, and it doesn't do any much better than. And even though that research is consistently replicated, antidepressants are still given to children in increasing numbers. Childhood depression is probably the most widely made diagnosis, along with anxiety. So it just spread. And so just as anxiety and depression, traditionally adult diagnoses were spreading into children. At the same time, ADHD and autism, traditionally child diagnoses, started spreading into adults. And this is what you find. This is why I call it a marketing brand. You find that with lucrative markets, they tap into a sense that I need this for my life to be better.
I mean, I take it that you aren't a fan of prescribing medication, which thank God, because I'm not either. And I fully understand the long-term effects of popping in pills. But for those who don't understand these things and they rely on medication because such is their state or their mood, what is the alternative for them? What should they do instead?
Well, it depends on the person, depends on the situation. I do prescribe sometimes, but there is no such thing as an antidepressant. And they are medications, they are substances that affect the brain just in the same way as alcohol affects how you feel. So they have generic effects. They don't have specific effects. Nobody's found any chemical imbalances for anything. But certain times, like, drugs that we mistakenly call antipsychotics, better word for them is their original word, which is neuroleptics. In other words, they inhibit neurological function. For somebody who's very highly aroused and, maybe has delusions and could be in quite a distressed state and could do things that are quite dangerous. I think in those sorts of conditions, it is advisable to do something for a while would reduce that level, but it's not an antipsychotic. It's a neuroleptic. It's something that's going to inhibit brain function, which means that your delusions, you won't hold them as strongly, you won't feel them as strongly, but they have lots of pretty awful side effects. And unfortunately, we use them long term. And so those people who end up on these long term, they have a much reduced life expectancy, and that gap between the general population and the population of who are classified as having a severe mental illness, in other words, the population who end up on these neuroleptics, that gap has been getting wider and wider. So long term is not great for people, but I do think there's an important place for them in the short term. So apart from that, I think these days a lot of the time I'm trying where I can to work with people to try and help them have a different way of interpreting their experiences. To try and help them see their natural resilience. I don't think resilience is something you can or should want to teach, because you only discover resilience by actually having to
experience it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. You can't experience it on somebody else's behalf. So I try to point out the things that they are managing to do. And I try to spend a bit of time understanding what model do they have? What is their interpretation of the meaning of these different experiences that they're having? What sense do they make of them? What sense do their parents make of them? What ideas do they have about it? And I try and help them away from interpreting their experiences as something that necessarily means they have to get rid of in order to feel better. I'm trying to explain to them that that's a trap. It's a trap. It's going to trap them somewhere. And sometimes people have quite an emotionally, that they can get quite angry with me.
Yeah, that you're gaslighting me,
and I think that's good. I like it. I tell them I like it when you get angry with me, because this is not going to mean anything if it's not arousing some of your emotions. It tells me that they're still working.
Yeah.
And I talk about the unconscious, because that's a way to tap into helping people see things from a different way. But, so I talk about acts. Do you believe in an unconscious? So I had a lot of interesting discussions with people. It's just trying to get into question
I love
that they have.
And the interpretations that we have of those experiences.
Yeah, because what I'm hoping that I might help them work towards is changing their relationship with their suffering. So rather than seeing it as something alien, something dangerous, something to be suppressed, something to find a way to cope with, as something that they have to learn to live alongside. They have to learn to understand. In a way, it is about then being more compassionate with yourself and not having such high expectations of what life is meant to be like.
Yeah.
And I try to have those conversations with parents too, because parents often carry these feelings and ideas because they're worried about their children, so they're accidentally reinforcing that they need to find a way to stop being so emotional.
Yeah. I'm very curious to hear what you meant by there is no such thing as a dysregulated emotion.
Well, what does a dysregulated? What's a regulated emotion? What the hell is that?
Okay, so the normal traditional view of emotions is happy, sad, chirpy, pep, and the stuff that's draining, withdrawals, angry is negative or dysregulated. That's how we understand emotions, or we have come to understand emotions.
Emotions are just emotions.
Yeah, exactly.
You have reactions, you have feeling. Regulation, if you're talking about regulation, this is something again to do with Western philosophy, I think. You're trying to impose a rationale. You're trying to think that you're trying to turn emotions into something that's intellectual, rational, because it's our rational side that thinks logically about regulating and dysregulating. You shouldn't be applying that to emotions. Are just emotions. So for me, the more important thing is how you interpret the significance of those emotions. Why are we putting some emotions in the sphere of dysregulated?
Okay, but would you say that there are emotions that serve and emotions that don't serve an individual?
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, there are emotions that are helpful to us, and emotions maybe. But even that, I don't know about that. Because again, we're kind of appealing to logic. What I'm trying to help people do is try and look at the, if you like, the meanings that they apply to their emotional experiences.
Sure.
So my pet hates, I have 3 pet hates at the moment. There's always pet hates that come along in their mental health ideology. My 3 pet hates are emotional dysregulation, which we've just talked about. Emotions are emotions. We look at a kid, you'll see emotions in its purest sense. They can go from being very happy to crying to being angry, and then out of it again. So emotions are just a form of energy. That's the way I think about it. I think about it as a viral form of energy. So you capture the emotions of the people close to you. Somebody starts laughing and you're in tune with them, you laugh along. So you start laughing. Somebody's angry at you and you're in tune with them. You get angry back at them.
Contagion, yeah. And
the higher the level of emotion going between 2 people, the harder it is to disconnect. So you can't get somebody off your mind who you're in love with, and you can't get somebody off your mind who you're angry at. You think of one as good emotion, the other as bad. They're just emotion.
True.
And there's just the level of intensity. So emotion dysregulation, that's nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Second one is overthinking. People talk about, well, unless you're really good at meditation, try and stop thinking.
Bang on.
Thinking. We're always thinking. That again, that's just, we might have annoying thoughts. We can have intrusive thoughts. We all have intrusive thoughts. You can have a song that you can't get out of your head and it annoys you. A song just goes round in your head.
The monkey mind.
Yeah, we can't stop thinking. So,
but there are some people who have managed to achieve a calmer state of mind. Would you agree?
As I say, if you're particularly good at meditation, you might be able to, in certain circumstances, to free your minds of thoughts. But for most of us, in our everyday life, and certainly with our kids, I don't want them to go around thinking that there's something wrong in them.
Yes, because we romanticize the Buddha mind. That's what's happened.
You're just thinking.
Yeah.
And then my third one is masking. So this has become a big topic now.
Sure.
That young people don't even have to have the symptoms anymore, for example, of autism, because they can keep it together during the day because they can mask their symptoms. So they have the symptoms, but they don't have them. So masking can be applied to anything now. It's being applied to why other cultures don't express, for example, depression in the same way as we think of depression in the West. Why don't they have, they have physical symptoms because they're masking. So all of these different presentations, they're masked depression. That's what they are. So we're using masking as the third way of turning things that are not symptoms into symptoms again. So those
Very
are my
true.
3 pet hates at the moment.
I love it. Thank you for sharing those. Really cool stuff. I have to just mention one thing. I found it's so beautiful how Johan in his book described your paragraph on how you dealt with ADHD. And it's just more environmentally driven than anything else. Like, it's about how a child's environment is, and that affects his state of being. So I'd love you to expand on this right now for our listeners.
Well, I mean, if you have this narrow concept of ADHD as a set of behaviors internal to the child, you're going to miss all of these other things that are going to be affecting a young person. And so, sometimes it might be a learning difficulty. Sometimes it might be the person is the sort of class clown. And quite often it is related to a breakdown of certain relationships that were important, and this particular young person, if you've had some horrible experiences in your past, well, hypervigilance looks very much like ADHD. If you're kind of hyper, I've seen kids who've been in domestic abuse, been in pretty awful environments, and they present as quite jumpy, Well, that was probably quite a useful survival mechanism. But I've also, seen it with kids in families who are just very stretched. And sometimes that is because a parent, most often the father, has disappeared from the young person's life. And so
separation,
the poor mother is
divorce.
left to, a mother is left to try and bring in an income or deal with financial insecurities and problems, paying the rent to the landlord, who then kicks them out, and they have to change school, and they have to change where they live. And so I've seen it as well in those contexts. And sometimes the most helpful thing to do is to see if there is a possible way of repairing or bringing the adult who's gone missing back into that person's life, just a lifeline for all of them. But also,
does that help their focus levels once that happens?
It just gives that person a sense of that, they were important after it. Sometimes it can help the sense of focus. Sometimes it can just over time help that sense of security, and that that the things are stable. That person. Sometimes the opposite to start with, because they're waiting for that person to go missing again. What I'm trying to say is there isn't a magic formula. Each person, that's what it's like when you're working in mental health. The first thing you need to get used to is that working with people's relationships, people's emotional life, it's messy.
It's very nuanced. There's no black or white in our lives.
There isn't simple formulas.
Yeah.
That's why labeling doesn't really do anything. And that's why the evidence says that matching a treatment to a diagnosis has a negligible impact compared to the other things that are going on in a person's life. One way I try and help people at an intellectual level understand that is a bit like if you take an apple, there are many things that you can say about an apple from a scientific point of view. You can talk about its chemicals, you can do studies in how to grow apples and you make apples bigger so that you more improve the productivity, very useful information to have if you're selling apples as an apple grower, etc., etc. There's loads of things you can say about apples scientifically. And none of that is going to tell me what it's like to bite into the sato. That needs a different type of knowledge.
True.
And it's not going to tell me what it's going to be like if you bite into that apple, because it's going to be different for you.
Yeah.
You might like
Same thing,
sweet apples,
very
you might
different
like
experience.
sour apples. I
Yeah.
might have some idea based on empathy, but that I might be quite confused based on my empathy. If I like apples, but you don't seem to like the apple that I like, I will find that hard to relate to because that's just not part of it. So it requires a different type of knowledge. When you're in the area of personal experience, that's where you find the limitations of the scientific approach. It's just a way of illustrating that there are different types of knowledge. And when we're working in mental health, we're working in a much more messy area of knowledge. It doesn't, can't be boiled down to these formulas like growing a healthy batch of apples might.
Yeah. So one of the many takeaways for our listeners from this conversation could be that depression is not a disorder, but would you say still concerning enough over long periods of time to get the help that they need?
Well, with all things like that, they can be very dangerous. I mean, if a person ends up with suicidal feelings and suicidal thoughts, there is a big cost. But what I think so one of the main messages from my book is that we need to rehabilitate emotion and experiences back into the realm of the other man. And understandably, the more we've promoted this particular idea of mental health as being something that you can separate from mental disorders, and that mental disorders are something that you need to pick up early and have specific treatments, the more we've actually ended up with what I think of as a war on emotions. So I want people to talk about how they feel. I want people to be honest if they're having suicidal thoughts and feelings and share that. And I can understand why they might be worried these days that it might end up with a, locked away in a hospital because we've alienated, we're in the process of alienating ourselves as a society from our ability to understand, to deal with, to live with intense emotional experiences. So my main message is rehabilitate emotions back into the sphere of the ordinary. It may not be easier to talk about it.
Love that. So powerful. I love your approach of compassion inquiry and, diving deeper to understand everyone's core needs. So beautiful work that you do, Doc. Thank you for everything you do. And before I let you go, how would you describe an epic being?
I've never heard that phrase before.
Well, always the first time for everything, isn't it?
What would you describe as an epic being?
No, it's of course a podcast, right? Becoming an epic being. Yeah. So what comes to mind when you hear that?
Oh.
Funky question for you.
In my latest book, Searching for Normal, in the last chapter before the end, the epilogue, I talk about somebody called Brooke Sean. She wrote a book about her battle over many years with, she was put on psychiatric medication when she was 15 after a bereavement, and it went on for many years, changing this, that, and then at some point she took the decision to bring herself off. And to rethink this whole idea that she was suffering with a mental disorder. And she sort of got in touch. I had the pleasure of meeting her in 2023 and had a chat with her. And to me, she epitomized the extraordinary, the ordinariness of the extraordinary that everybody has in them the possibility to do extraordinary things.
I
And
love that. Wow.
sometimes only when circumstances come in your way. So she, through her own insight, courage, went on a very difficult journey, got herself off medication, and then she began to realize that there were all these other people who were saying that this is not the best way to think about the mental distress that you went through. Your response to your father dying, that was what happened in her case, was an entirely understandable one. So she wrote a book about it. It's a very good book. So
that truly is an epic being.
Yeah, that's the sort of person that I think of, and I think it's something that we all have it within us to be epic beings, if that's what an epic being is.